Through the Looking Glass Darkly won a National Emmy Award in 1974. The producer, Bob Dotson. Associate producers, George Wesley, Oliver Murray, and not with us, Charles Hoff also was an associate producer. Right. Gentlemen, how did you come up with this idea to do Through the Looking Glass Darkly?
Well, I was sent to Douglas High School. Back then we called it Black History Week, to do a story on black history. And at that time, the students there put up a great big book and opened up the pages of the book and just went back and forth on it, and some student would step out and started talking about the history of Oklahoma. It was a news story at that time, and I just mentioned to my news director at that time, Ernie Shilks, that I think it'd be a good idea if we do something on black history. Ernie, said, yeah, okay, and sort of shrugged it off, and then about a year later, I thought it was all forgotten, and the announcement was made in the newsroom that Mr. Dotson here was going to become the head of a new department, and that would be our first project.
That was when? 1971?
That would have been 1971, 72, something like that.
Bob, when did you arrive at WKY-TV?
I arrived back when the Earth was cooling. 1969, and so in those days, you remember reading about it in the history books, in the 60s, most people weren't, my age, were not interested in news per se. We wanted to do documentaries because we had the true religion and we wanted to tell people about it. And I came from Syracuse University back east in New York State because Channel 4 had a long history of doing documentaries up to that point. And I remember Ernie Schultz, the news director, came to me and said, I think we ought to start something on Sunday morning, kind of a swivel chair talk show where you could talk to black preachers, about anything in the community. Because, of course, in those days we had no black reporters. Oliver, I think you were the only guy on staff at that moment.
Right.
So, at any rate, I said, well, wait a minute, why don't we do something more? We've got these great historical documentaries, why don't we do something on black history? So I said, let me run it past, and when he came back, he said, I got an idea for you. You can be special projects director, and it'll be a title in lieu of a raise. And I had just gotten married. That's the reason why I know when we started it, because when I got back from the honeymoon, I didn't have a weekend off for a whole year, because that's when, I still had to do the news stuff as well. And they would give us like 6 minutes of film a day that when we had a chance to go out and do something. And we would go into people's homes and we'd do the old Greyhound routine. You sit next to somebody long enough and they'd go, well, let me tell you about my brother-in-law. Well, and because you're a stranger and they don't know you, they'll tell you. And once in a while they would come around to something that would be of real significance, and then Oliver and I'd kind of wink at each other, and I'd try to work them back around, because the average age of the people in the first hour of the Looking Glass, I believe, was between 85 and 95. And we had to find, a lot of it was the detective work, of finding somebody that had had some history, but also could remember it.
Right.
And could talk about it.
George, when did you get involved?
It was 73, actually. I made the commitment to come at I think about November of 72, but at the time I was teaching at Grambling College and building a radio station. So I wanted to complete that, and in between time, during breaks, I would come and watch what they were doing.
You're talking about your schedule, Bob. How much time did you all devote to this project?
Oh gosh, I think I was full-time on it for 18 months. But it was a 90-minute documentary. The original idea was to do the easy thing, because in those days, people, when they thought about black history, thought about political history, civil rights, because we were deep into that struggle at the moment. But I had an idea that I said, why don't we go back to the beginning? Because being from outside Oklahoma, which I think was a plus, because I was curious. And then to find out that they had 28 all-black towns, and that they had black marshals and mayors, and all the things we know today.
Well, we'd have to fight to a certain extent to get out and shoot, because both of us was covering the news. I was a news photographer and Bob was a reporter, and we worked side by side doing day-by-day news. So he would make phone calls and line things up, and we would go in and come in on our days off or whatever we can catch and go out and stay shooting for an hour or so, or maybe one whole day. And that would be very, very rare to get one whole day, because the main project at the station was the news.
We'd check out funerals. We really did. In fact, one of the sequences that you'll see in the show, one of the classic sequences, were 3 old men in a beautiful spring day sitting under a dogwood tree swapping stories. And then Oliver and I kind of just sidled up to them, and the next thing we know, we heard about Baz Reeves, who was the first black federal marshal. and all this stuff that we'd never heard of, because there was a judge, for instance, over in northeastern Oklahoma, who was the reason that many black families around Muskogee ended up with more land. And it's a great story, and you'll see it in the show if you haven't seen it already. And all of that happened because we just kind of hung out at a funeral. And that's the best way of doing this kind of journalism, because you know, these people don't send out resumes, and they don't send out press releases. These are folks who just generally, when you walk up to them, say, well, why are you here? I'm nothing special. Yeah. And then that's when we grin and walk right in, because they do have things that are special. So
and one of the things about that is that you would talk to people about, well, can you tell us something about the early days? And, well, no. So do you know anybody who was of any significance? And not really. And I remember we were at the old calligrapher's house, and we were leaving, and there were some photographs there. And they said, well, who is that? I said, oh, that's so-and-so, and he was a marshal over in Fort Smith. You know, because they think of them as Uncle Joe or Uncle Fred or whoever, and once they get talking, like Bob said, then you get a wealth of information.
This was like a big scavenger hunt. I mean, really, it was like an
That's about the
18-month
way to
scavenger
describe
hunt.
it.
Because somebody would have a photograph like
Right.
that, but no memory of what the photograph was about. And then you'd walk around with it kind of like a sandwich board, you know, like, did you see that? And the guy go, that's Baz Reeves!
Right.
And then boom, they'd tell you the story about it, and you'd put the two of them together.
Was there anyone in particular that was the most helpful, that gave you more direction than anybody else? Did you know people in the community that helped out?
I'll tell you the person who helped us the most, and he was already dead, was a fellow by the name of Benny Kent. And Benny Kent was a Pathé newsreel photographer from 1906 until his death in 1946. And he would go out and shoot stories that would send to New York City for the newsreels. But because he was a storyteller at heart, he would shoot stuff that he knew he couldn't sell. Black history, a Native American history where they weren't wearing feathers, but doing something regular. Women's history, but besides women who were in swimsuits, because that was the stuff that would sell in those days. But he shot it on old nitrate-based film, which was highly explosive. And so he kept that in the ceiling of the fire station up in Stillwater, because he figured if it blew up, it'd be close to the hoses.
Right.
And when they were, about this time we were starting it, you know, they were tearing down the fire station, and they'd found this great cache. And I didn't find it, but the firemen did. And they went to the people who were there just before all of us came, and they had convinced them to get a bunch of footage transferred, whatever they could save. Well, we had a place in old Channel 4 between the ceiling of the newsroom and the roof of the building, which we called the land of the midgets.
Yeah.
Land of the midgets, because you
Right.
could not stand up. But that's where, at the end of every newscast, you'd coil up your film and you'd just kind of throw it in there, right? So I went up there when we were thinking about starting this, and I found this old Benny Kent footage. And it had things like Geronimo's last buffalo hunt up at the 101 Ranch, things like that. But it also had various films from black history. So I started carting that around and showing people and saying, listen, well, I got people interested. You know, because they did, first of all, in those days, they didn't think that anybody cared about their history, and there wasn't much that had been written down at that point.
A lot of them really didn't think of it as being history. To them, they were just living, trying to scratch and make it on a day-by-day basis, you know. I mean, you go out and talk to somebody about coming to Oklahoma and living in a dugout for a couple of 2 or 3 years while they built their house. To them, that was just living, you know. Black cowboys, they were just doing their job, trying to survive on a day-by-day basis, until Dotson and George and myself got a chance to stand and talk to people. And I guess it's like what we're going through right now. Our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will say, well, this is history that we're living right now. So
Right.
basically, until someone actually started telling the story of the past, no one looks at it as a history.
How much source material was available in libraries and various places?
Well, I went out to Langston University and I said, what do you got on black history in Oklahoma? And the librarian said, well, we got a lot of the Harlem Renaissance. And I was a kid, and I said, well, Harlem, that's New York City, right? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you got in Oklahoma? And I said, nothing. in the schools, in the public schools in Oklahoma City, I can't remember the lady's name, but they had just written a textbook, and that was it was like a workbook basically, and that was the only thing we had. But it gave us a little time frame, you know. But beyond that, it was mostly people. It was in their closets, it was in their bedrooms, it was in their heads, and so we, you know,
And
fortunately
we had to beg for the pictures.
had to beg for the pictures.
We had to literally promise them we would get their pictures back to them, and after we got through with them, we personally went back and carried their pictures and handed them back to us, because we had their life, their treasures.
Right, right. George, why wasn't there a better record kept during that period of time? Great history.
Well, there were probably records that were kept, but they were not seen, I guess, as significant in the mainstream libraries and that sort of thing. And that's why the digging is so great. You know, you just had to go to wherever you could and put it together. But as far as a chronicle, I guess the closest maybe would have been the Black Dispatch that had been around for a good while. I mean, if you went through their volumes.
But you remember, though, they'd had a fire. And so, or maybe it was before you came, but they had a fire, so they didn't have any archives.
Right.
That's why we went to Langston. And but you see, also, I think that's why the program has had such an impact over the years, because it was a gee whiz all the way through it. Like, well, gee, I didn't know that. You know, even people who had lived it didn't, because they hadn't talked to their grandparents yet, so they didn't know about it, the younger people. And so that's why it had such a boom in your face, because in The Looking Glass, it wasn't a political piece. It was just people telling a story. And you know, stories only happen to people who are allowed to tell them.
You know, like, I think what a lot of people don't understand is the title of The Looking Glass and what it really means. And that's why Dotson came up with this title, is because we were invisible. And that's the way we lived. We were there, but to the average person, we were just invisible. And that's why it comes to The Looking Glass Darkly. And Dotson was the one to come up with this, with the title of the story in the first place. You know.
In the production of this, you shot film. How did that limit you, what you were able to do, or direct how you had to do it?
Well, a lot of things were real dark.
We're laughing because, you know, film was gold. I mean, we take a 25, I had to take a 25-foot of film, and if I didn't come back with at least 3 stirs on that, on that roll of film, you know, my news director had me in front of his desk as a waste. I mean, you learn how to shoot, and every shot had to count. I mean, what we threw on the floor was about a little strip about like this here.
You edited in the camera.
You had to learn how to edit in the camera. There was no shooting. Even news stories, you edit in the camera. And,
how much would 200 feet be?
Oh, it would be about 6 minutes.
All right, so you didn't have much to waste at all.
No.
How did you get those stories on film? Because obviously people might take forever to tell a story. When did you know how to do that properly?
Well, I learned during the process of this that people always answer your questions in threes, which I will do as well. They answer the question they think you've asked, and then secondly, they explain their answer. And if you wait just a beat, because people hate silence, they'll go, well, dummy, that's why I killed my wife, which is the sound that you want. I mean, you want them to crystallize their thought and just get to it. And so that's what we would do. We wouldn't roll the film camera until after we got close to the number 3.
right.
It's
And
sort of
they
like
give it a signal.
yeah, it's like a sports
signal.
Yeah. Sometimes we'd be sitting there focused up, and you have to focus on 3 different people, but you stay wide. And once Dotson gives me the signal, whatever the signal is going to be, he'll call that person's name. So all I had to do was just pan over, tighten up. Boom, it's there.
It also helps you to say, huh. Because, you know, they'll tell you, you know, this is really wonderful, and then it's all done, and you know the camera's not rolling, you go, huh?
Huh?
To get them to repeat it.
To repeat it the same way, because if you don't, they'll say, like I said before, and they never say it like they said it before, because it's like a joke. Second time doesn't have the emphasis, doesn't have the timing. And so it became, I mean, obviously I went to school on it. It's lasted me 30 years since. I mean, be able to find the sound that actually crystallizes what the person wants to say and be rolling when it happens.
Did you have a favorite character that you met?
I have 2.
Who?
And I'm sorry I can't remember the names, but the very first opening shot.
Charles Ellison. He was sitting out in a field of daisies. He was pushing 100.
About 98, and just had a son,
Yeah.
6 years old.
6 years old. And he had been out literally plowing with a mule. And then we wandered up this hill. It was late in the afternoon, beautiful light, and he sits down, and we got to talking to him, and he said, you know, I'm one of the last of the sacred harp singers around here. And this is one of the very first things we shot.
The very first
And
time.
so he pulls out this old hymnal, and sacred harp singing is singing a cappella with no accompaniment. He had perfect pitch. He starts singing, and he goes through a phrase, camera's rolling, a shadow comes across the sun, and he goes, you can't read it. And he goes, that's it. My eyes are about gone. I'm old, too old.
Can't do it no more.
But I can't, you know, that's important, but I can't do it no more. And that, of course, became the closing. And the opening was the same thing. We set it up with him going into his field of daisies, you know. But his name was Charles Ellison, and he was one of my favorites. The other guy that I loved was an old man who was out in Kingfisher, Oklahoma, who was in his 80s, and he was holding court at the end of this cafe, and he was telling this story about a man by the name of Paul Sykes. And I'm not going to give it all away, because if you haven't seen the show, watch it on a rerun. And I don't know whether this runs before or after. But at any rate, this old guy had told that story, obviously, so many times in the coffee shop that nobody wanted to listen to it anymore.
Yeah.
But I was 23 or something, you know, so I thought, well, I never heard it, you know. And it turns out that he had absorbed this great history about a man who had basically saved Kingfisher. Kingfisher probably wouldn't be there today if it hadn't been for Paul Sykes. This is a great tease to watch the show, or what? And then now the thing was, he was as old as the man he'd been talking about. So Oliver came out the next time, and the old man put on a coat and went out to the railroad station where the fellow he was telling about in the story used to go out and sing to the passing trains, and he sang the same song. And we waited till a freight train came by, and then we would doze all back and forth from the picture of Paul Sykes and the old railroads at the time. And that's how we would tell these stories, by not passing up people who had good stories to tell and having a little patience. And this one thing in our business we seldom have is patience. That's why we always go after the people with the sound bites, you know, the elected officials who know how to give you 20 seconds real fast. But other people have these great stories to tell, and if you can just play the Greyhound bus, you know, and sit next to them a little bit, they'll tell you things that'll last a lifetime.
George, do you have a favorite?
Probably several, but I keep thinking about the little old lady who was talking about earlier days. Was it the riots?
Birdie Farmer. Birdie Farmer.
Bird farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She was in the, what do they call that riot in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right.
Yeah.
And she was a school teacher back then, and she moved here.
And she also was at the
Courthouse.
convention. She was at the convention, the very first state convention, and watched the governor being elected. And then she was like a clerk typist or something.
Her husband worked
Yeah.
there.
And she said, you know what's the first thing that the legislature passed, or discussed at least, was whether or not we were people.
Yes.
And she says, I was invisible sitting there, but she said, but I heard him. I heard him, you know.
Yes. Yes.
And that was in the second one, you know, when we started getting into this. In fact, the second part of the Looking Glass was called The Struggle for Civil Rights.
Total of 90 minutes.
90 minutes.
Total of 90 minutes. One thing that I think is striking about Through the Looking Glass Darkly is that you don't talk very much. You're a storyteller, but you let the people tell the story. Did you think at the very beginning that that was going to be the way it would work out?
Well, our first boss pounded into our head that journalists were interesting, but they were not nearly as interesting as the stories they covered.
That's right.
And that sounds so archaic today, because, I mean, we're all into personality journalism now, you know. How does it affect me as the journalist? But in those days, I mean, who was I? I was a 20-something kid from St. Louis.
There was no stand-ups.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
why? I mean, if I could find the right number of people to put into the story that were interesting and articulate and had a good story to tell, and you could keep the pace up, then I figured I could live a long and happy life in journalism. And so that's why I did it. I just said, you know, let's put a few lines of copy and let them talk. And we had the great pictures that Oliver and all of us found.
You got Ralph Ellison?
Yeah. The Invisible Man.
How did you find him?
Well, he was easy to find. It was hard to get because he was expensive. He lived in New York City, and he wasn't planning to come out to Oklahoma City anytime soon, and we didn't have any money, and we couldn't afford to get a camera crew in New York City to go talk to him. So I think we hired an audio guy to go over and set up in his living room, and I sent him a list of questions, and he was very gracious, and he talked about it, and he was the author of a book called The Invisible Man, which is exactly what the theme of this story was anyway. And so we sent him the questions about that and about Charlie Parker, right?
Right.
The great jazz musician. And then we were able to put some of that, excuse me, Charlie Christian.
Charlie Christian.
And so we were able to put some of that into the story too.
Was there anybody that you wanted to talk to that you didn't get a chance to talk to?
I don't think so. I think it worked the other way around. We were just thrilled to get who we got.
Get who we got. You know, we, like in the second half, that was a lot easier half to do because most of those people I grew up with, they was either my school teacher, we lived in the same community, I've known them all my life, so the second half was not that hard to do. I mean, talking to people like Jimmy Stewart, Melvin Porter, Clara Luper, those people was in the community and very active at that time. It was that first half that was sort of hard to get, but if we listen and we listen hard enough, they was telling us about something that took place. And our job was to go out and to make sure that it was authentic by doing the research on it, which she's being modest about. I mean, a lot of this is checking and double checking, checking the dates, checking the day a person's birth certificate have on it, going to a newspaper and making sure that these things that we're talking about is authentic more than anything else, because we didn't want to have anybody coming back challenging us on these stories. So we, you know, had to do a lot of legwork. And in the process of doing the legwork, we could be somewhere and they said, well, have you met so-and-so and so-and-so? He knew Bill Pickens as a personal friend. And we go to his house and started talking to him, and you know, he would sit up there and tell us about Bill. Well, I didn't know him personally, but I used to go with his daughter, you know. So,
the great cowboy.
The great cowboy, and how Bill Pickett discovered bulldogging. I mean, it's just one of those, you know, just beating the paper.
Charlie Christian's brother.
Yeah.
Well, like I say, it was a real detective's job, which was part of the fun of it, was the curiosity of going from house to house.
You didn't have much in the way of graphics. You look back now and you see that the graphics were fairly rudimentary.
Yeah.
Fair?
Yeah. We would have used hand puppets if we had them.
That had to be a challenge. Ken Burns, a more modern documentary filmmaker, can use graphics from time to time very effectively, but you didn't have too much to work with there.
No. But we had the cast. We had the people with the really terrific stories to tell. And if you've got that, if you can hold them with that, the rest of it's all icing on the cake. You know, you can get better or worse, but basically it's the stories.
And you're telling it in their way, so it's much more sincere than somebody else trying to say, Miss So-and-so did this and did that. But, you know, you remember the little lady who talked about Oklahoma and how long she'd been here?
Came in on the run of 89 or 93 or something.
And then she said, she had false teeth, and she said, I don't like Oklahoma yet. You know, things like that you can't orchestrate.
Yeah, she was grabbing for her teeth as she was saying it. And we closed one of the half hours with that.
Yeah.
But it was a great challenge because we had to put it together much like a movie. We had to have a beginning and an end and a chapter, and we had to bring it up to a certain level each time. It wasn't just, as you'll see, it isn't just a string of reminiscences from older people. We had to put pacing, and we had to find, sometimes we would take old films and throw them down on the floor and walk on them a while to make it look old, like they were Hollywood films, and then we would layer that over the pictures we wanted them to pay attention to. But you know, today you would take your laptop and your graphics machine and do that in 10 seconds, and we were literally doing anything we could to bring some style and graphics to the stories. And like I say earlier, Benny Kent's footage, the old Pathé newsreel, helped us a bunch because at least we had some things that moved. Because you can't do an hour and a half with still pictures and old people. I mean,
and music played an integral role in the program, and I'm sure that didn't just happen by accident either. That had to take some time.
No, actually, I wrote both shows listening to the music, because I often found that you don't have a lot of time to write. I mean, you have plenty of time to write, but you don't have a lot of time to put it in the story. It has to run, 6 seconds or 5 seconds. So I'd have to write it kind of like a line of poetry. So I would get, my wife worked, Linda, in those days it was Linda Puckett, and we'd just gotten married, Linda Dotson, and she worked on the radio side, and we got all these albums that didn't fit the rock and roll format, but they were neat, because it would be like Quincy Jones in a failed movie. So no one would remember the movie, the music would be new.
Right.
The trick with music is not to get some song that everybody recognizes, because then they stop listening to you and they remember, you remember when we had that date and we loved that song? So, but if you can get a recording from Quincy Jones in a failed movie so that no one remembers the recording, you got great music. And so I would listen to it over and over again as I would sit there and type that part of the script, so that the words would fit the music, and the music would fit my mood, and the mood, of course, would be spawned by what we had just heard or whatever,
And post-production was, imagine a studio twice as big as this one, with pictures from the wall to the ceiling, and music playing in the background, and all of us thinking about what shot we're going to put where, what beat we're going to end with, or what picture, and it's just one of those things with, just talking about it and seeing how it's going to fit, and everybody sort of doing their own thing, and it sort of fell together.
We were part of the wood-burning TV era.
So did you mesh? Did you have some creative conflict?
No.
Or did you know where you were going and you were on the same page?
We didn't know where we were going.
That was
It just happened.
Right.
I mean, if we had a leader, it would be Bob.
Yeah.
And the rest of it just sort of fell together. It wasn't a power struggle. We were doing the best we could possibly do to help each other.
Well, the neat thing about doing a story like this is it's like playing in a jazz ensemble. You're riffing all the time because you don't know where it's going. But the fun of it is the riff. And then you step back and, good creativity comes from not caring who gets the credit, because that way everybody feels, empowered to step forward. They don't think, oh my God, if I say this, he's going to hate it because it's not his idea or my idea, whatever. That'll kill it. Because what happens is, like with a good jazz ensemble, when all the players are just having a lot of fun, you come up with something better than individually you could ever do. And in this case, we knew we had a powerful story. We finally ended up with some really good people. So when we sat down into post-production to put it all together, we just went with what worked, which is the hardest thing to find out. It's like asking a sculptor, well, how do you know that's in there, Right. Well, you throw away everything that doesn't fit, Well, how do you know? Well, I don't know. That's the hard part. But basically, that was it. We had the good building blocks to start with.
So how long did the shooting actually take?
I don't know, about 6 months maybe?
Yeah, over at least over 7 months. And it was, like I said, it was not a day-by-day thing. It was like once every 2 or 3 weeks we might get a chance to go out and devote a day or devote an hour. Sometimes we couldn't get these people until they got off of the regular jobs at night, so we had to go to their house and be there at 7 o'clock at night and started setting up and keep them up. And a lot of them would not let you stay beyond 9.
Right.
So we get set up. They let us in early. We set up the lights, and like Bob said, we talked to them for a while with the lights up so they can get used to it, and they'd ignore the camera. I wouldn't stand behind the camera a lot, but after we've heard the story, we had an idea, and he gave me the signal, and once I got the signal, I saw the ease over behind the camera, and he, well, you told me something about a couple of minutes ago. What was that you were saying? And
Right.
there you go.
Then how long did the post-production take?
A lifetime. I think I locked myself into a bedroom at my house and went about 2 days and wrote the first show. And all I had in there was all these, pieces of paper all over the damn wall.
You should see the pieces. Big as my thumb. Some of the paper he would come in with sometimes was about the size of my thumb, and it'd just be pasted all over the wall and everything.
And my wife would, throw a pizza under the door, but that would be it, because you have to, when you have something like this that spans from 1830 to 1907, and all the people you've met, and the biggest problem, of course, is you fall in love with certain things, because you climb to this top of this mountain, you're going to jam that in, and that may take you all day to realize, well, you climbed to the top of the mountain, but it doesn't fit. So don't put it in, because you're killing it, And so what I did was I just walled myself off and at least got the script done. And then from there, the biggest problem then at that point was to make it come alive and figure out how to do the film and the sound effects and the music and all that. But that was the fun part at that point. Once we figured out how this story goes where it goes, and we were fortunate we already had the bookends. We knew we were going to start with the old guy out in the field, and we were going to end with the shadow coming across the cloud, or the cloud coming across the sun. So once we had that in our mind, the rest of it was just okay.
George, as you saw this coming together, when did you think that this might be really something special?
I don't, when you say really special, like maybe winning an Emmy,
right.
I didn't think that. But I thought it's a very important piece about black history in Oklahoma. Because I was learning too, because I came, I'm not a native Oklahoman like Oliver. So I came here from Louisiana, but a native Arkansan. And so as I looked at it, I was learning a lot about Oklahoma, and, like Fort Sill. Never crossed my mind that black soldiers had anything to do with Fort Sill, but they built it.
You know, the key to doing this kind of story is not to set out to do a history. Just do a story, storytelling. Because if you if you put that little mantle of history on it, people go, oh, Jesus, sort of like I have to go to church here and they're going to preach to me for an hour. So what I did was I made sure that the people and the sound bites that we had would come across as ordinary, interesting people. And then I would set up each response in the story so that they kind of teased you with what was going to happen. Like, for instance, we had the last of he was talking about Fort Sill, we had the last of the Buffalo soldiers' wives. All the Buffalo soldiers were dead, but this wife was still alive. And so we teased her a little bit in the story in terms of how she was going to tell her story. But she said, you know what my husband said to his dying day about being a Buffalo soldier? Nope. He said, well, he says, the best thing was that George Armstrong Custer was offered to be the leader of the Buffalo soldiers. And he said, I wouldn't lead those guys anywhere. And she said, my husband would always grin, and he said, we went to Fort Sill, he went to the Little Bighorn.
A fateful decision for him.
Right, So those kinds of stories, what I wanted was, I didn't want to preach to the people who would normally tune in, like 3 history teachers and 2 85-year-old black Oklahomans, go, yes, I love that story. I wanted to get the people who didn't care, and hopefully they would be in it 20 minutes before they realized they were having fun watching this thing. So it's like Bill Cosby's humor at his best in the 1980s. He could tell a joke that would make a 4-year-old giggle and an 80-year-old giggle because he touched all the universal buttons. And that's why I wanted to present these people, and Oliver did too, and George. We wanted to present them, first of all, as engaging human beings with a terrific story and suck everybody into it, like you do. You get to a movie or something like that, and I'm not going to like this, and then you're into it because it's really good theater as well.
I don't believe that we actually knew that we had something great. We were just doing something that we enjoyed doing. I enjoyed being a cinema photographer. Bob and George here, they enjoyed writing and producing. And yes, I'm from Oklahoma, and I hear the stories that my grandfather was telling me about coming in on a covered wagon as a little boy and all this here, but again, they're just stories. And as far as having something great here, I never thought about it from that standpoint of view. It's just something that just kind of happened.
How was Through the Looking Glass Darkly accepted in the black community?
Well, I would venture to say at that time, when arms was open wide. Again, did we do any advertising? This was a Black History show the first time we ran this? I don't remember. I think we just said it was going to do it. It was a documentary.
No, we said it was a history of black Oklahoma. Yeah, absolutely. We had a picture of Peril Bruner, and it ran on all the ads and stuff. Yeah.
But and I imagine the whole community maybe could have tuned in at that particular time. But the second time, I know everybody tuned in on it because it was a difference in going to the grocery store and somebody saying, and at that time we did something quite similar to what we're doing now on that second time that it ran, and that's people got a chance to see the people to put it together. So in grocery stores, people hollering at you and things like it's here,
And obviously it won an Emmy Award. That was a momentous time, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was an evening. Some of you may recall this. You remember President Nixon, who told the world that he was not a crook, and Dan Rather had a big fight with him, his first. That was at that award ceremony that night, which happened to be in Houston, and I was there. The station said, well, you know, if you can get there, we'll be glad to find you a seat. There wasn't a whole lot of money because we didn't think we were going to win. And you know, we were in Oklahoma City, you know. We were up against Geraldo Rivera, who at the time was working at the ABC station in New York, and there was another documentary from WRC in Washington, D.C., the big NBC affiliate, and then there was Oklahoma. At any rate, so we're down there, and it was the first night of a young correspondent who had just gotten the White House beat. You might recall, some of your viewers, his name is Tom Brokaw. So Brokaw said, Bob, it's really wonderful. You're from Oklahoma, you know, I've been there a couple times, you know. And he said, did you think it was terrible what Dan said to the president? And you may recall, some of you who maybe old enough to remember it or read about it in your history book, but Dan Rather asked a very pointed question to President Nixon. It was all during Watergate. And so Nixon said, what are you running for, Dan? And instead of saying nothing, Dan mouthed off at him. He said, I don't know, what are you running for? Something like that. Well, everybody goes, oh, you know. So that was all there. And then in the midst of all that, they said, oh, and by the way, Oklahoma City just won this Emmy. So nobody remembered it except for people in Oklahoma. We were like in a 4-foot hover, but everybody else the next day was like, oh my God, Dan Rather, you know, was yelling at the president. You know. And so it was quite a thing. It went on. Besides that, everybody remembers the Emmys, but it won a DuPont Columbia Award. Which in many ways is as big. Robert F. Kennedy, who had just been assassinated just a few years before, they had an award that they established only 3 years prior to that, and it won the grand prize of the Robert F. Kennedy Award. And then it ran in the Smithsonian in the screening room for about 6 weeks after that. So I mean, this thing took off. But basically it was because, I think, we had people telling stories that nobody at that time had ever told on television. Yeah. I mean, if you were a big name black artist, you might have been on TV, or a writer and all that. But ordinary people, this is like 10 years before Ken Burns, but ordinary people telling a story, it goes right through the screen, and other ordinary people can relate to that, regardless of their color or background. And I think that's why it took off.
Well done, gentlemen. Thank you for doing the project. Congratulations again on the Emmy.
Thanks.
Many years later, Bob Dotson, George Wesley, Oliver Murray. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.